Lecture 2, Liberalism Introduced.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this lecture, I'm going to introduce liberalism. I'm going to do this in the following way. I'm going to start by discussing the sort of disagreement that might take place at a dinner party, where people who've been at school together had got engaged in conversation and then moved to the area of politics. I'm then going to trace the way in which the kind of disagreements that you might find amongst such people relate to ideas that are to be found in the thought of some key figures in the history of liberalism. I'm going here to talk about John Locke, Adam Smith, and John Stuart Mill. After exploring briefly some of their ideas, I'm going to see how those ideas and tensions between them serve to explain and to underpin current disagreements of the sort from which we started. Accordingly, then, let us imagine a dinner party. We're here in a setting where people who'd been at school together, at college together, had got together as a group for a kind of reunion. At the point when people had reached dessert, their talk moved from issues of catching up to issues of contemporary politics. And the talk perhaps turned to issues about welfare. And here one might well imagine a spirited disagreement taking place. On the one hand, there might have been some guy who became an Ivy League professor in the Northeast. He came out in this discussion as a defender of the welfare state. Within such a welfare state, he said, the rights of everyone would be respected. The rights not just of the powerful and the successful, but the rights of everyone would be respected. And what's more, within such a setting, people could develop themselves. People also could enjoy a certain kind of autonomy. They'd be free of a kind of groveling dependence. And he said, in order to get this, what you need in the background is a guarantee by government that if people can't manage these things by themselves, that they will get assistance from the government as a right. By way of contrast with this, there might be some other figure. If we're dealing with stereotypes, imagine the other figure is an entrepreneur from Palo Alto in California. She also stresses issues about rights. But here her emphasis is on individual rights, including property rights and including the right not to be taxed for the benefit of others' welfare. She, though, would stress that she's not against giving others a helping hand, but she sees this as being a matter of what she chooses to do with her hard-earned cash, rather than something that other people have got a right to. Indeed, she might stress that she gives to charities, but she does so in line with her own values and also in line with her ideas about what works. She says, look, I'm an accomplished businesswoman. I will only give to those outfits which explain both what their aims are, but also which explain that they're effective. They're called to account, just as a business might be. I give, but, she says, forcing her to give violates her rights and also leads to the continuation of government programs that she thinks are ineffective as well as ways of assisting people. She might say, by way of contrast with the first guy, that she's a conservative. But in fact, the two different positions, in a sense, derive from different strands within liberalism. Indeed, we'll look at this in the rest of the lecture. It will, I believe, be interesting in itself, but it will also serve to introduce certain key aspects of liberalism. What we're going to do in this context, as I mentioned, is to look at three key figures: John Locke, Adam Smith, and John Stuart Mill, and then we'll return to our more contemporary controversy. First then, John Locke. Who was he? He was English. He lived from 1632 to 1704. He was educated at Oxford, and he then left scholarly pursuits to work for a lord, Lord Shaftesbury, who was a politician at the time and a leading opponent of the King, Charles II. Charles II was kind of a source of big worry to Shaftesbury and other fellow-minded people. Why? Well, he appeared to be taking power away from Parliament, acting, in a sense, without parliamentary accountability, without getting the permission of Parliament in order to levy taxes. But they were also worried about him because he was a Catholic, or at least suspected of being such. Why, though, was that a big deal? Well, at the time, Catholicism wasn't just an issue of religion. From a British perspective, if someone was a Catholic, it meant that they were kind of aligned ideologically with European powers who were opposed to British ideas about liberty. The situation was a bit like someone who perhaps was a communist in the 1950s in the US. Namely, that while they may be conscientious in their political views, people were suspicious of them because they seemed to be lined up with the powers elsewhere in the world, at that time the Soviet Union, which it was thought were going to call into question liberty in the US and in Western Europe. Very similar situation. Locke followed Shaftesbury, indeed, into political radicalism, and Locke's well-known political work, The Two Treatises of Government, was in effect a defense of liberty against the crown, against the king. What Locke was doing was appealing to natural rights, to liberty, and to acquire property. He was appealing, too, to a right to revolt. He had the view that if a king, say, started acting in ways that called people's rights into question, he could be hunted down like a dangerous wild animal. And indeed, the American Professor Ashcroft, who's a specialist on Locke, said these weren't just theoretical ideas in Locke. He wanted to claim that there was a practical application to them as well, and that Locke was tangled up in a plot, the so-called Rye House plot, on the king's life, basically attempting to kill the king. It was unsuccessful, and Locke didn't wait around. He moved off from the UK to the Netherlands and stayed there because he was afraid for his life. Indeed, there was another guy who had rather similar views to Locke, who also had a kind of involvement, who thought, no, I'd be perfectly safe. A guy called Algernon Sidney, and he was executed. So, in this case, you've got someone who had theoretical ideas, but put them into practice. Locke came back at the time of the so-called Glorious Revolution. He returned to England and to his career in writing as a kind of professor, although he wasn't teaching, he was just writing and researching. What, though, you might say, is all this to us? Well, there are a number of themes in Locke that speak down, in a sense, to us in our own day. First of all, there's the notion of individual rights, that people shouldn't be interfered with, they shouldn't be coerced by other people, and that their property should be left intact as well. If they haven't broken any laws, if they've been behaving decently, then the government just can't come in and interfere with them. In addition, you get notions in Locke of people acquiring property rights by way of what he describes as mixing their labour with, say, land. You have this picture in Locke of people being able to acquire property not as a result of grant from the government, but if the property is unoccupied, essentially by putting it to productive use, the stuff then becomes theirs. The purpose of government itself is basically, from Locke's perspective, to protect such rights, to protect individuals and their property against other people aggressing on them. And indeed, these kinds of notions, that this is the purpose of government and that government itself shouldn't be aggressing against individual rights, including property rights, echoed right down through the American Revolution until today. It is, though, worth noting three further features to them. First of all, from today's perspective, I guess, the political aspects of Locke's approach look kind of firmer, more secure, more approachable, as it were, than Locke's own ideas about the foundations of these rights. In his own writings, it seems to me, there is a religious basis to